Okay. Well, hopefully this afternoon will be less formal and more interactive. That has to do with whether or not I can control myself from going on these long monologues. There were a couple of loose ends from before lunch. And I just want to say one thing about the time ideas that we were playing with. I presented the imagine this scenario as though it were a time machine with a lady temponaut sailing off into the future. In a way, that's just an image to ensnare you into playing the game. There are serious reasons for thinking that you can never send a person or an object into the future. But those serious reasons don't interfere with the notion of information moving backward and forward through time. And so I just want to make clear that the lady temponaut was a provisional image, and what we should really be talking about here is information moving backward and forward through time. Then the other thing to be considered is the image of the machine qua machine. Again, this was simply to allow us to play with this science fiction scenario. The thing which might allow information to be moved through time could be a drug, a plant, or simply a shift in attitude. This is very important, that it's possible perhaps to imagine a language that allowed this to happen, that somehow the hidden and occult nature of the future is really a syntactical problem. I mean, we know that our language bequeaths us severe conceptual problems because of the subject-object division in it that gives permission for an inside-outside kind of point of view. But it may well be that the temporally relative tenses in our language predispose us for a certain view of succession, past, anticipation, and so forth. I'm sure you've heard it said that in the Hopi language, there is no past, present, or future. There is a kind of nunc stans. And since I don't speak Hopi, I can't attest to this, but it certainly seems to hold out the possibility that this thing which we take very much as a part of the physical universe may in fact be a linguistic assumption. The other thing that I wanted to touch on and to remind you of was this morning's talk was basically based around the image of the edge of history, trailing and leading. And first we talked about the trailing edge, the origin edge, where we passed out of prehistory into history, and then we ended the morning by anticipating a post-historical or eschatological mode. And the case I was trying to put across was that the navigation from one to the other in an economical and expeditious manner involved having a symbiotic relationship with these hallucinogenic plants. What I want to talk a little bit about now is the fact that these relationships to these plants did not cease during the period of deep involvement in the historical process, that there has always been this tension around this issue of accessing the other by shamanic means, specifically hallucinogenic plants. And the most obvious example in our own tradition is the Eleusinian mysteries, the mysteries that were celebrated at Eleusis every September and involved the drinking of a potion and then the experience of a hierophany that really informed the Greco-Hellenic vision of the world. Everyone who was anyone had this experience, and if you obeyed the prohibitions, then you only had it once in your life. So imagine a situation where after months of anticipation, it was like initiation into a super Masonic order. After months of anticipation, you would go in September with hundreds of others who were also first-timers to this shrine on a plain outside of Athens, and the priest there would have gathered the sacred barley and brewed what Wasson, Ruck, and Hoffman identified as ergotized beer, and then having drunk this, you would enter into an inner sanctum, and the mystery would be revealed, and you would have only one crack at it. So there was no second look. There was no comparing to previous or later experiences. It was just a one-shot kind of thing. All of the great civilizations have had extremely intense relationships with plants right up until the present day. I'm presently working on a book which is tentatively called Why People Take Drugs, and it examines, it's a revisioning of history along the lines of seeing history as a series of relationships made and broken between people and plants. And for instance, the impact of opium and the way in which British policy manipulation of opium in the Far East set up China for colonialization by the West. Extremely cynical use of native plant materials in a diplomatic way to unstructure a civilization. Some of the modern demographic problems of Indonesia, as you probably know, Java, which is the main island of Indonesia, is a 700-mile-long island. It's the most densely populated landmass of its size on the planet. The reason is because in the 19th century, the Dutch paid the people of Java to have children in order to supply labor for the labor-intensive sugar industry. Now, sugar is a drug. Anybody who's raised children can tell you that sugar is a drug. I mean, you give it to them no earlier than a half an hour before bedtime because, you know, they spiral into such a state of hysterical hyperactivity that that's all that you're going to be able to stand. The impact, the whole cycle, one drug leads to another. You know, it's sort of the relationship of opium to morphine and heroin is very similar to the relationship between sugar and rum and distilled alcohol. You know, up until the middle of the 19th century, a portion of pay in the Royal Navy was your ration of grog, the amount of rum that you were given, and officers got more, and so forth. The whole development of mercantilism in the New World was a cycle of slaves from Africa to work New World sugar to produce distilled alcohol to support the maritime adventures of the British Navy. And a huge amount of rum was actually conscripted first. In other words, the Navy had first dibs on the distilled alcohol. The impact of coffee on modern industrial culture And again, this goes along with print and the linearization and the rise of the worker, and all of these things were being reinforced by activity manipulating drugs which didn't have any particular vertical rise to them, but which make you work faster and longer and complain less. I mean, if you think about coffee, this is the only drug I can think of that has managed to get itself institutionalized in the labor laws of nearly every high-tech country on earth. So that the coffee break, and before that the tea break, but let's be frank, the caffeine break, is absolutely a part of any high-tech industrial culture. And I don't think a culture can probably come up to speed without the availability of caffeine. The last one I touched on this morning, television. And television has all the attributes of a drug, all the drawbacks of a drug, and is the first of the electronic forms of stimulation, of which probably a huge number loom ahead. Some of you may know the writing of William Gibson, Neuromancer, Count Zero. In his books, people are recorded. And a particularly vibrant, intelligent, healthy, virginal 16-year-old girl can become a hit. Not the song she sings, but the person she is. And you just buy the cassette and drop it in, and you're her in her flower print dress, wandering through fields of daffodils, swept by warm winds. I mean, you can tell that this is a multi-million-dollar seller, and gives you an idea of the kinds of drugs, the kinds of modalities, the future of sensory stimulation that lies ahead. Television is only the beginning. Newspapers are an early anticipation of this. I mean, the daily newspaper is not greatly different from the daily fix. And it's interesting, I've particularly noticed this in the Bay Area and have spent, the last 20 years of my life relating to this area. This curious form of conversation where each person proves to the other that they read the Quran this morning. And so it's presented as new information. And the polite thing to do is you never say, I know, I read it too 5 hours ago, just like you. You say, did you hear what, and did you know? Of course you know, because we're all addicted to the same drug, which is, somebody reads the Examiner, but who it is, we only hear by rumor. So I call attention to all of this to attempt to shore up my case that drug-free life isn't even a good idea. Not only is it impossible to achieve, it should not be achieved. That our symbiotic relationship to nature is such that without these non-foods, which nevertheless affect mood, cognition, sexual performance, ideation, stamina, and so forth, we become depressed. We are symbiotic to this vegetable matrix. And so then what the challenge is an educational challenge to choose one's addictions judiciously. It's like a good model for it is to think of human beings as computers, to think of these molecules as software. A computer without software is an oversized paperweight. It does not do anything. And what is coming into us is continuous spectrum of metabolizable material. Some of it is gaseous. We breathe it in from the atmosphere. Some of it, a large percentage of it, must be proteinaceous to actually reconstruct the physical meat, bone, and sinew of the body. And part of it is precursors of neurotransmitters, serotonin in bananas and things like this, which now we're moving in the area of drugs and pre-drugs. And then part of what we take in actually are things which affect the modality of consciousness. If we need to understand this so that we can make intelligent choices, so that we can find, which is my preference, or design, which is the preference of the pharmaceutical companies, drugs which function to assuage our existential situation, but don't make us non-functional. The naive approach to drug design in the early years of this century was, you have some kind of a chemical compound derived out of nature, let's call it opium, and it's good for pain, analgesic for pain. Well, so then your strategy as a drug designer is to make it 10 times stronger or 100 times stronger. The problem is this makes it 10 times or 100 times more addictive. And so then what you find is, for all that you've gained in the analgesic dimension, you've lost because the thing is too virulently addictive. It is not something that has been mediated through the natural environment, so it quickly blossoms into a huge social problem. So again, this is an argument for looking at the historical use of substances. What has worked over the millennia with a minimum of social disruption, a minimum of wear and tear on the individual and society. And the interesting thing is that really before the 19th and early 20th century, the only identifiable drug problem in society probably was alcoholism. And it is the first of the synthetic drugs. It is the first example of taking a harmless vegetable product, fermented wines and beers, and turning it into a super strong, super addictive commodity. So part of the challenge for the archaic revival, for feminists, for environmentalists, is to realize that that we are going to have to form a common front, that if there is a basis for a new political order, it lies in revisioning our origins in the way that I've described. And what that means is the factionalizing between these groups has to cease. And that means, I think, a tremendous step forward in the level of discussion about the role that these chemical compounds are having in society. Because in most situations, feminists don't want to defend psychoactive drug use. They have a tough enough agenda to defend on their own. Ecologists don't want to defend it. They're barely able to attain respectability without that. And we don't see much evidence of that. Now, perhaps the whale songs, the octopi dances, but if this is epigenetic display, it's extremely ephemeral. We alone carve stone, cast metal, and invent alphabets. And this epigenetic tendency goes to this lady's question very cogently, because is the epigenetic function simply ancillary to the life of the body, or are we in the process of in the Hollywood phrase of cheap science fiction, becoming creatures of pure energy and information. In other words, are we somehow...
We already are.
Well, pure was the operation.
This whole idea of materiality, it arises from the duration, from observation of duration, gives rise to the idea of materiality. But when one breaks things down, atoms, quarks, one continues to hunt for the material stuff, and one continues to, the scientist is sure that it's there. He still hasn't got a grip on it yet, but it's basically the assumption that information cannot exist without a material template upon which to be engraved. And if one gives up the idea that there need be a material template upon which to engrave information, then we can accept the idea that we are information. And the fact that there's the duration gives it the sense that there's something there other than information, because we think of information as ephemeral, that it will dissolve if we look the other way.
Well, one of the problems with science is that its most fundamental epistemic assumptions are the ones that it made first when it was most naive. And one of those assumptions is this thing that information must be accompanied by matter. It may not necessarily be accompanied by matter. Now they have these parallel processing machines. Previously, computers, however fast they were, could only do one thing at a time. They just did things quickly. But now at MIT and other places, they're beginning to produce parallel processing machines where it works simultaneously on many parts of a problem. Well, a computer person that I know, yeah, for very complicated problems, you could think of a ribosome as a computer. Because what does a ribosome do? Well, it reads an RNA tape coming in, it assembles proteins according to the incoming code, and it pushes them out the other side. Well, it would be possible if you had a parallel processing machine with several tens of thousands of parallel processors to actually model a cell on screen, to produce a functioning cell that was made of information, that was not a model of a cell, but that was a cell in an epigenetic information space. So then you begin to wonder, well, if you had then a million times greater capacity than that implies, could you actually assemble an organism on screen? Can we look forward to the day when there will be photonic chipmunks sold in pet stores, replicating, devouring their young and copulating for all the world like real chipmunks, but are in fact creatures of an epigenetic phase space? If we can look forward to that, I think probably pet litter is no place to invest. Yes.
These little bits of information around.
Well, then you just go up to the top of the cage and hit the empty trash icon, and that gets rid of it.
Connection at all between what they call them, the Manichaeans.
Manichaeans.
Yeah, and they believe that human beings are creatures of light trapped in a physical body, and at some point there's going to be an object which is going to take in the light of everyone and allow it to escape. And if we are creatures of energy and light, or pure information, and it can be reduced to energy.
You mean then we could download ourselves into a chip?
Silicon-based type environment, and that would, perhaps give us a possibility to consider about the evolution.
Well, but
of
this
our
woman
body,
has
right?
serious problems with this.
Well, no, the body's going to die anyway, so we'll just have to make one to step into.
Oh, you mean so you don't do this until you're sure you're at the brink of the bardo. One door says bardo, one door says chip. And, well, this would lend new cogency to the phrase chip off the old block. Or chipmunk.
With probes, right? On the silicon chip. I thought you were talking about little animals. Which is it?
Along with my idea before about actuality and possibility, I could see that in one direction you could download what we got here into a chip, into a more of an information stock. And on the other side, we may all be chips ready to be produced into a next higher level of actuality.
Yes, that was what I was about. That was what I was going to say. Try to prove that you are not downloaded onto a chip.
Right.
You will discover that it's very tenuous. There is it's possible that the world of three-dimensional space, time, and motion is some kind of necessary conceit, and that what really exists is nowhere apparent and is in fact more like a solid state matrix.
The question that comes up is, what about feeling? Because we're talking, and that's what she was talking about, I think. What about feeling? Because when we're talking about downloading into a chip, there's a sense here that we got information, but we don't have feeling. And the mystery of feeling.
So the question is, are you trying to extract information out of a process? I mean, I think we probably agree that we're, for the sake of the argument, we're fairly real and we're very complex beings. And if I understand the gist of the young lady's argument, she says there's a lot to be gained from looking at the body process. Now, whether you call those feelings, whether you call those thoughts, whether you call those experiences, there's a very, very complex process going on.
But there's a difference between feelings and thoughts.
I wouldn't necessarily. So I think, being a pretty strong mechanist that way, and an information dualist, I would agree with Terence. It's very hard to say whether or not you're downloaded. In fact, I would probably argue metaphysically that we are downloaded. But the question is,
there was a previous creation of the human?
that information is somehow more important and is primary as opposed to matter.
And this is what the Buddhists are saying when they say all is illusion.
But I think the point is how much information can we get out of the fact that we have become corporeal and that we are downloaded and we now are capable of taking a look at the substrate that we're loaded on. We can gain information from swimming in a swimming pool or climbing a mountain or sitting in a dark room or what else, studying physics or whatever. And there's a lot of information to be gained because we are corporeal and because we are reflexive. And the question is, at what point do you wish to say, hey, I'm done, I can be downloaded on a chip, I've got everything I can get out of the several billion DNA cells.
At what point is when you can recreate it?
No.
Until the first humanoid that walks in, and I'm not sure if this is one or not, but he's still a nice guy. If we can bring our technology to that point, then that's the answer to your question.
But the same problem is you can't decide whether or not you can download it on the chip. I defy you to develop a process to say that you've managed to download everything that you had before.
Well, that's when
There is a regress there. But there's also another issue which revolves around feelings. These may not be ontologically distinct things. It's simply that energy follows attention. And we have sent attention into the world of physical minutiae. Because, as I tried to argue this morning, it was an early interest in taxonomy that stimulated us to language. you must have noticed that we have very few words for feelings, and that things are not really real in the cultural space unless you can talk about them. That's the whole motivation for talking about psychedelics on my part. It probably, whether they know it or not, is a large part of the motivation for the touchy-feely schools of psychology to say the things they do. They're saying, you know, you have to explain to people, how does it feel to say, I love you, I'm sorry, I resent that, or it makes me feel this way. We have not directed our attention toward nuances of feeling, and hence we have no vocabulary for it, and so it resides in a kind of ghost-like sub-reality that we can never quite talk about. Look at the sexual revolution and the literature, pre-sexual revolution, where they could barely indicate the act, you know, and you were somehow just supposed to pick it up out of the morphogenetic field, how this was supposed to be taken care of. And then we empowered language and cleared a lot of that obscuration and neurosis out of the picture. So, and I think that, going back to the themes of this morning, dissolving the male ego is a tremendous empowerment to creating a language of feeling, a language that is not at war with nature and matter, but that is self-reflective upon itself without a dualism. Yeah.
It's not just a matter to me of creating the language, but from birth allowing children to feel their feelings, because we're, at least a culture, if not a whole planet, that doesn't allow the feelings to be felt, and it's in the feelings of them that they are dissolved and don't become an impediment to relationships and thoughts and everything else.
Yes, there's a concept right here which is very useful, which is the notion of state-boundedness. It's useful for talking about psychedelics. It's useful for talking about feelings. What state-boundedness means is it refers to all those things which go on which you can't remember. And we don't pay attention to ourselves, but imagine yourself in your home, alone, doing what you do, washing dishes, answering letters, whatever you do. And this is a very rich kind of mental environment. Thoughts come and go about your relationships, your financial difficulties, your expectations, other people, what you want to eat, what was in the newspaper, and then the cloud of free association which accompanies this, a la James Joyce. But then if someone comes to the front door and asks you, what have you been doing? The answer is nothing, because we do not have language to encompass and deal with this unconscious flow of information. So for us, it becomes nothing. We are all really very, very schizophrenic, because we signal each other with an extremely provisional language, and yet when asked if there is anything else other than this provisional language, we deny it. We say, no, there isn't.
But isn't that more I don't think it's actually not much as memory involved. It's just a matter, it's a signal saying, that's my private space.
No, I think it's really
I just don't want to
memory.
discuss it.
I think people can't remember. I think people cannot. I think most, people say in drugs you can't remember what happened 10 minutes ago. Hell, in life you can't remember what happened 10 minutes ago.
The brain is filter anyway.
That's right.
Otherwise we're overwhelmed.
But what's interesting, he sort of spoke of it as generalized. We do experience the world as very rich, and we immediately forget it. Immediately. Because there's more crowding in to experience, but in principle, we could be more aware of at least the structure of our musings, which some people are. I mean, this is a very individual thing.
Yeah, I'd like to say that basically that structure, those things that we do at home, those nothings, in the Buddhist tradition and the mystical Christian tradition are matters of prayer. So for people that have a language that can hear you, what have you been doing? I've been praying. In fact, you have. It's a very profound activity.
Yes, I think you can boil down Buddhism to a single, in terms of method, to a single statement. Attention to attention. That's all it means. That act of self-reflection is Bodhi mind. And that's what most of us don't do. It's certainly what I don't do.
Not to attention.
Pardon me?
We pay attention, but not to attention.
That's right. We pay attention to input.
Stuff that's being thrown up for reaction.
That's right. That's right.
Is there a translinguistic or non-linguistic possibility available to us? That's what I confront in the water with the whales.
Well, I think that, I mean, if you want to think of it as a diagram, what you've got is you've got the speakable. And then and that's ordinary discourse and what we're doing here. We're trying to deal with the speakable. And the speakable edges off into the yet to be said, the potentially sayable that has yet to be said. The poem's not yet written, the connection's not yet made, and surrounding that is, of course, the truly unspeakable, that which is outside the theater of cognitive discourse. And to ask questions about it is to misunderstand how to play the game.
I want to point out that from an evolutionary point of view, there's going to be a lot of selection against attention to attention, because you should be paying attention to that tree or that tiger, and not to how you feel about that tree or that tiger, or the tiger will eat you. And that is something to take into consideration in terms of habits of thought. Speaking of feelings, I am uncomfortably hot. Is anybody else warm? Can we do something about
Let's, it's 3:45. Let's take a 5-minute break and readjust all parameters. Well, there are a couple of things that that we need to cover in this last hour, but I want to, as a sort of a segue into whatever discussion there is, I wanted to tell you about an incident that happened in Southern California that I found very interesting, and I've been thinking about it ever since. Some of you who follow me closely know I've been thinking about it ever since because I mention it so frequently. But when I spoke at the John Ford Theater in LA, I was dog sick. It was an uphill battle, definitely. But when the question and answer period came, the first guy up to the microphone had a question for me, which for some reason he thought was a real stumper. This was the question. He said, I've inquired of the I Ching about the fate of the planet, and it seems to have a less apocalyptic point of view than you do. And so I want to tell you the change and have you comment. And so his throw for the fate and destiny of the planet was 19, which is work on what has been spoiled, changing to the cauldron. And to get from work on what has been spoiled to the cauldron, you have one changing line. And the reading on that line is, work on what has been spoiled by the Father. So, for some reason, he thought that this would slow me down. I could barely let him finish asking the question in order to dig into the interpretation, because I thought it was so extraordinarily apropos. Work on what has been spoiled. this is certainly the task before us in the final seconds of ordinary human history. And we, if the admonition is work on what has been spoiled by the Father, then two things immediately come to mind. The planet has been spoiled by the Father. In other words, through unleashing industrial processes, consumerism, deep surface mind, the whole gamut of technological, male-dominated enterprises. And secondly, but not secondarily, what has been spoiled by the Father is the feminine. And in fact, the despoilment of the planet and the despoilment of the feminine are merely the interior and exterior aspects of the same malignant attitude. And I guess what he thought was puzzling about this this series of changes was that the end state is the hexagram for the cauldron. And he found that difficult to interpret. But my interpretation of it is there are only two hexagrams in the I Ching which refer to man-made objects. One is the well, which is not exactly a man-made object. It's more like a construction where man and nature are sort of intimately spun together. It's a hole into the earth to get water is what it is. But the uncontestable synthetic object in the I Ching is the cauldron. And so then it became necessary to interpret what the cauldron was symbolic of, if we see it as symbolic of the end state of human history. Well, it has a number of associations. First of all, it is clearly the completion of the feminine. It is like an alchemical vessel, a uterus. It is something in which things are cooked, meaning brought to completion, meaning alchemically transformed. And it is, of course, an artifact. And we've talked much today about an artifact at the end of history, an artifact which would sustain, which would reinforce humanness, which would give meaning to the historical process, which would rescue meaning from the apparent denial of meaning that history represents. And then finally, the symbol of the cauldron is the symbol of the alchemical work, of in fact shamanism, of the brewing of plants, of the communal food pot, as well as the shaman's crucible for preparing the transforming plants. So it seems to me that the I Ching in this instance, as usual, offered a particularly cogent and rich encapsulation of where we have been and where we need to go. Work on what has been spoiled, work particularly on what has been spoiled by the Father, and see the culmination of that work in the manifestation of the alchemical vessel of transformation, whether viewed as cooking pot, uterus, technical object, magical object, and so forth.
In a personal process, I also splash on what was spoiled by my father when I was a little kid. There's a lot of work that I have to do in my own internal process on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think we all are microcosms of the social macrocosm that this set of changes is addressing. Yeah.
One thing I want to mention about using male
and work on what is spoiled by the father, that I have recently noticed with men, and I've had a conversation with a woman that's been doing groups for some time, that it is very hard for men to actually accept their maleness, at least at this point. So I think it's very hard when you speak in terms of, that is the problem. That for most men, I think it is becoming grounded in their maleness, becoming male, that is a primary necessity before men can move.
Well,
it
I
really
think
isn't about men.
the male thing has to be divided away from the ego. And this is what has been so difficult. I mean, male ego is almost an indissoluble word.
Yeah, the thing that's hard is that the male and the male ego thing is so entwined that when one lets go of that paradigm, the male ego dominator paradigm, a man is left with, well, Christ, what's left?
Well, that's a beautiful way of putting it. Christ, what's left? In other words, it is the legacy of monotheism to leave you nothing. If you give up the male ego, then what have you got left?
What it is to be positive and feminine, but what is it to be positive and masculine is more of a mystery these days.
They're both mysteries. That's a fair answer.
The custom of raising one's hand in a group where there's someone supposedly leading, like in a classroom, is a very good way to work on becoming masculine and feminine. Because it's hard for the little boy to raise his hand and wait for the female teacher to call on him, but then to give an answer in front of the whole group. That's, everybody has to work on that. So I think it's a good custom. Although we don't do that in normal American Western, settings where it's just sort of speak when you get the urge to do so. And I think that's the aggressive.
Yes, because that means the most aggressive person will gain the floor every single time.
Right, and that creates the doctrine of the group accepted belief structure that dictates our culture from now on. So we can't force people to start raising their hands. Did I forget to raise my hand? No, we can't. The only one who can do that is the one who's leading. And I certainly couldn't.
Did you want to say something?
No, it just hit me so hard, what was said, that it was so hard on what you answered.
Anybody else want to react to this? Yeah. Go ahead, and then.
All right. She was talking earlier about this feeling in her chest, in here rising up, and it was rising up when in the beginning you were saying about the end of history. Maybe this is we really don't know the history about our feelings or what rises up. Like I'm looking at you right now, and suddenly you change. What caused that? I mean, language might have a feeling of it, but I think that's what she was getting at, and that's something after the calendar. I mean, like we get up in the morning and it's morning, and it's October 22nd. We know this. But there's something in here that rises up. That's.
Some of you may know the psychologist John Perry, who runs the Jung Institute in San Francisco. He recently wrote a very interesting book called The Heart of History, which is, I think, addressing this thing you're talking about, trying to talk about the emotive role in history and in thinking about it and in feeling it, which is something we have never done. We've always held it back. I mean, if you feel history too much, you will be paralyzed to act. These are the words of Adolf Hitler. If you feel too much of history, you will be paralyzed to act. This means, to me, that ignorance is a prerequisite for political activity. Yes, it seems to be. And so I think what we have to do is open our hearts to the feeling of history, and then we would move with a great deal more care. I mean, this is, I think, one of the things that the psychedelics do so well. I mean, they show you the greasy smoke of burning villages against the gray skies of Central Asia. They show you the horse-mounted warriors sweeping down on the Achaean plain. They make you feel the sword and the lash and the cannon and the musket ball. They show you what a brawling, horrifying, and exalting experience it has been to get here. I mean, we take it so for granted, but, you know, tell it to the dead, the millions and millions of people who went into the ground over the past 500,000 years so that we could sit here and philosophize. And so it isn't, people always say, you know, what kind of world shall we leave our children? Well, you also have to ask, what kind of world shall we leave our ancestors? How are we responding to the legacy that we have inherited? I mean, our richness is almost impossible to conceive, and our profligateness is equally difficult to conceive because we act so blindly. We act in such an unconscious dimension. I mean, this I really think is what lies behind all this New Age talk about the ancestors. It's not just, you know, smudge to the ancestors and move on. What we're trying to talk about is imagine the hopes and fears and cares and concerns that stand behind each one of us as we try to imagine the 1,000 or so generation of people that are our ancestors, the ancestors of each one of us. How many campfires, how many migrations, how many epidemics, how many instances of injury, illness, delirium, how many times, I mean, it's just almost inconceivable. I think this is why we block it out, because you can only feel a certain amount of it, and then you just would dissolve into tears to try to imagine the momentum that lies behind us. But that's what we're trying to recover. So the real nightmare to me is to try to imagine what if all that were rendered meaningless by a truly global nuclear war, let us say. And so then the entire enterprise is as nothing. All those people did die in vain. All of that suffering and toil and dreaming and wondering and hoping was just delusion. It always rests with the living to redeem meaning out of chaos. And if we, because we are so pampered and enclosed in the artificial and the synthetic and the transient and the tawdry, if we lose touch with that heart of history, then you know, we become capable of an almost unimaginable crime, a crime that will touch not only humanity yet to be born, but all humanity that has ever been. So I think that's the existential responsibility.
Yeah, I feel that we've already committed the crime. I don't think we have to wait until buttons are actually pushed. I think we're slowly sliding off the edge, so to speak, and we can look at frame by frame progressions toward it. We've already committed it. The fact, I had an experience in San Francisco about a year ago. Been involved with some legal stuff, and there are things on the books that protect people from other people running around with hammers and hitting them over the head, and yet each one of us has tons of explosives targeted at us. And I saw it. I mean, I was walking down the street and I saw it. I saw it. Every person on the street had this huge shadow looming over them and following them. And yet we're not recognizing it, and yet we're not pointing a finger, and we're not screaming, and we're not crying, and we're not beating our chest and doing something about it. We've already committed the crime. I think it's already happened.
Well, it's not happened until it's too late. I think it's very clear, and I said this on Will's show yesterday, that it's a race between education and catastrophe, and that the race is neck and neck. I mean, it is going to be won by one or the other by a hair's breadth. It isn't that... Well, it's just very, very uncertain. I mean, I see tremendous positive things going on in the world. Almost all of them responses to situations so hopelessly screwed up that you can barely conceive of it. So, for instance, you have atomic arsenals, and therefore an extremely sober and concentrated discussion about the future evolution of warfare. The atomic arsenals have superbly concentrated the minds of politicians on what is really important. So then you have something like AIDS, which has the paradoxical result of creating a truly pan-national sense of community, where national borders mean nothing. The information must be gathered without deference to national borders. The medications and experiments must go forward regardless of the opinions of national governments. So here is a force for cohesion. The problem is, why do we have to be like the donkey? Why do we always have to be hit between the eyes before our attention is focused? Now wars seem to be becoming obsolete. This isn't because Christian charity or any other brand of charity has broken out in the boardrooms and chancelleries of this planet. It's because there are no theaters of war where it is a good investment. Now it's a bad investment everywhere. The people who are making war obsolete are not making war obsolete for the good of you and me. They're making war obsolete because they own the joint. And they don't want barroom brawls that bust things up. So as we extend control over every aspect of our lives, one would hope that we can address some of these more gross imbalances. But notice that limiting nuclear arsenals, curing AIDS, backing away from the arms race and stuff like that does not at all address our psychology, the violence that we do to each other. And that is the root of these larger structures of institutionalized violence, and new forms of institutionalized violence are continuously being invented. Propaganda, television, reducing entire populations of decent, ordinary people into consumer-oriented zombies. Yeah.
Terence, when Leary came along and said, tune in, turn on, and drop out, he seemed to hit a live nerve for that generation. Do you see any phenomenon on the national scene today that can affect people that same way? What's doing that? What's reaching people that way?
Well, I don't belong to this faction of the New Age that always proclaims that we have just turned the corner, and from now on it's going to be wonderful. I mean, I think that we are about to descend into a well of nightmare like nothing we've seen in our lifetimes. That's the whole point for getting together and talking like this. I am not a cheerleader for a group of people who are about to take power. I'm trying to talk to people whose beliefs and commitment I think is going to be sorely tested by what lies ahead. I mean, it's very clear that a decision has been made to destroy the entire Western notion of civil rights and due process. I don't know how many of you saw in the New York Times 2 days ago, but Margaret Thatcher has decided to eliminate the right against self-incrimination in Northern Ireland. You will no longer have the right to remain silent. You will be compelled to testify against yourself. Okay, so this is a legal right enshrined in British common law that goes back 350 years. Now, in this country, it was only by the narrowest of votes that the drug bill was passed without a provision that illegally gathered evidence could still be submitted and would stand in a court of law. So I think the paternalistic male power structure is ready to slam everybody to the wall in an effort to control the drug thing, which is primarily seen as pulling power away from the quote-unquote legitimate power structures. These international drug-dealing syndicates are more powerful than most governments. Governments like Ecuador, Bolivia, and so forth can be bought and sold in the world marketplace. I mean, if you have $5 billion, believe me, you will get a hearing in these countries. So that the real debate now inside places like the American government is whether or not the American government should just replace these criminal syndicates, come out from behind the elaborate theatrical mask, and peddle the drugs directly and not have to tolerate these rival power centers. This is the sort of thing that is going on. Yeah.
I'm glad that you are bringing up these practical things about just how we are approaching this time, this edge. We have only 22 years and 2 months. Is that it?
Something like that.
Like that. Okay. I know I have the feeling to have very close friends that I can rely upon now. Because I feel this dark period coming upon us too. And I really welcome when we get together in groups like this, because I look at the faces here, and maybe later I'll see a face that I can trust later on.
You mean when you're hunting rats in the sewer?
Right. Somebody to share a rat with.
Well, yeah, somebody to share a rat with. A rat and a rat.
But how do we as small groups network with one another, provide some kind of a vision of this future? Or are we just going to be living in this vertigo state?
Well, I think what we do for each other is we empower communication. We talk about what's never been talked about. We share our visions. We legitimize our visions and each other's visions by talking about them. And also, I'm not entirely pessimistic. Remember, I talked in a general sense this morning about how everything is speeding up, and there is this compression against the membrane of the post-historical milieu. We are headed into a dark age, but things move so quickly in the present situation that the dark age we are headed into will give way to a renaissance by the mid-90s. And that renaissance will end with the discovery of a new world, whatever that may be, and that discovery will usher into a kind of resonance of the Industrial Revolution and then the 20th century. In other words, between now and the apotheosis of 2012, we are going to have to relive all of the history which lies essentially, in my opinion, between the fall of the Roman Empire and the present. I think the moment that we're living in right now is a kind of extended Roman twilight, all the signs are there. And when once George Bush is in place and all the phony supports have been kicked out, then the shit will just hit the fan. And the consequences of a $1 trillion deficit and everything that accompanies it will hit home. Well, so then in the early 90s, there's going to be a period very much like the Dark Ages, but much briefer. Well, what characterized the Dark Ages that holds any amount of hope for people such as ourselves? And point of view, it is unwelcome everywhere because it drags down what is a fragile enough consensus. But the problem is, until this is dealt with, we're just going to be hammered on and hammered on and hammered on, because the theater in which the discussion is taking place is entirely under the management and control of the patriarchal male ego crowd. They're setting the agenda, they're defining the goals, and don't be fooled, they are the ones who profit most by keeping this drug thing oppressed and suppressed. Because if it ever were understood that the mechanism by which psychedelics reform society is by dissolving specifically paternalistic ego structures, then the wave of alarm that would sweep through the military planning centers and corporate boardrooms of dominator culture would probably create a backlash of significant proportions. So that's all just by way of linking up origins and end states, by showing that throughout history we have been augmented, reinforced, vitalized, inspired, driven, if you wish, by these synergistic compounds working on human consciousness. Is there a comment on any of that? Oh my God, there must be comment.
I got a comment.
You have a comment. That was a spurious comment.
This one's spurious too, but an image of the December of 2012 date came into view, which was the inauguration of our president in that year. 2012 is when he inaugurated for coming 4 years. Maybe doing a little psilocybin on national television to sort of let's bring in the new era where this is the sacrament of the paternalistic power struggle finally gets and it becomes part of national awareness for our coming new age.
Well, Phil
maybe
was
we could have a party,
Oh well, I think a party is unavoidable at this point.
New political party emerging in today's 1988.
The American Mushroom Party.
Why not? Where all we're saying is, let's try to hold on to the ecology. Let's look at the ecology as being our only salvation at this point, because it is in such dire straits that unless we save it or reach out to it and consciously try to save it, it could be the end of us.
Yes, well, Metzner was making the point last week at the ITA conference that nuclear war, which has focused people's political will quite impressively, is only a possibility. There are no nuclear wars being fought anywhere. But the destruction of the environment of the planet is going on 24 hours a day, around the clock. 8 football fields are cleared every 3 seconds in the Amazon, day in and day out, year after year. The planet is in crisis. It's not clear even that it's reversible. This discussion of whether to save it or leave it may no longer be relevant. If it's sinking, If we are on a planetary Titanic where it can't be reversed, then the save it or leave it issue is moot. Let them debate it in the lifeboats. Back here.
I think I know a whole bunch of things.
Oh, good.
I'm not really sure how to weave this in, but this morning with all the earlier talk about the origins, I really felt very related to that. And as soon as the time machine came in, I put my notebook down, and I felt very uninspired by the idea of, again, another technology to take me further away from myself. And I keep wondering, what is the body's relationship to this? Because if we go by the understanding that history, probably, and future is deeply imprinted in us physically, it seems like there are answers right here. And that it's not necessarily something that we will, if we can feel it here, it all seems like it's tied together with ecology. We can only destroy the earth if we have some picture of ourselves that's negative, if we're not feeling what's happening. It's like Rion talks about the selective deadening of empathy. So to me, the issue of developing my empathy or feeling more, and that's what I assume that the drugs do, is enhance our capacity to use what we already have, to feel, to become more perceptive, to really engage with what is. And it's not about an idea that we will come up with, because our ideas will always be limited by that which we've already seen. But the experiences that I have physically generally are ideas about myself that I don't already know. That it is a deep historical memory here. And I don't think we have much of a concept of that at all.
Well, this is a good thing to talk about. It's not resolved in my mind at all. I feel sympathetic with what you're saying. I mean, it comes close to my best instinct, which is that the body must somehow be central and must be the bottom line against which everything is measured, and not only the body, but what I call the felt immediacy of primary experience. In other words, the here and now thing is very important, and all this stuff tends to drag us away from the here and now. But when you think about these issues, I think you get pushed into this pretty difficult place where you are going to have it one way or the other, and it's very hard to create a clean fusion of these things. It's the old Gnostic problem. Do we belong here? Is this our place? In which case we must value the body, reclaim nature, come to terms with the planet, and get hold of ourselves in that context. Or are we passing through? What it really boils down to is the question, is the universe good or bad? Is it where we belong? Is it our home? Is it the creation of a loving oversoul of some sort? Or is it, as the Gnostics felt, an iron prison created by a mad god to enslave a creature of whom that mad god was actually jealous? And it
just makes me think about that's the basis of our religions.
To come down on one or the other.
Well, that the body is bad, that physical is bad. I mean, Christianity is really, there's nothing in Christianity that reveres the body in any way.
Well, maybe then our problem is worse than we thought. Maybe we are this body-centered, nature-centered creature, and it is our horrible destiny to have to actually witness the loss of nature because of the historical momentum of the patriarchy. In other words, if we could have somehow come to this understanding 500 years ago, it could have been halted. But coming to it at this moment, perhaps we are going to have to become that which we really would rather not become.
You know, just in terms of really working on personal process, that is always, you have to recognize that first. You know, there is a need to recognize what you are physically, or what the problem really is, or what you actually, what your environment actually is first. So I think that that is of primary importance, to identify ourselves that way, to understand from that place what the problems are.
Well, but it's hard to find the bottom of that question. I mean, what you're really saying is, well, the old style of the question was, what is man? But the new style is, what are human beings? Are we, and there are two possible views. One is that we must begin with the phenotype, in other words, with the body, that everything proceeds outward from the organization of the senses and from the organization of the physical being. The other point of view, which is the gene swarm view, says no, the line between species is just an illusion of 17th century or 18th century taxonomists. And actually what is happening on this planet is that self-reflecting, self-replicating information systems are loose, and the part of us which we call human is just sweeping through the primate organization toward its own self-imaging. And you know that poem by William Butler Yeats about sailing to Byzantium, where he says, I can't quote it, but he says something like he would like to be an enameled bird singing for the lords and ladies of Byzantium when out of nature when once out of nature I am cast, meaning after I die. When once out of nature I am cast, I would be an enameled bird singing to the lords and ladies of Byzantium of what has been, what will be, something like that. So I don't know how to handle this. I haven't decided myself, really.
I don't see how either of those two views necessarily contradicts what the young lady just said, particularly the gene swarm view. I mean,
well, the gene swarm
but if
thing...
she's holding for immediate personal experience of the individual unit of the genome as being something that has evolved, so that we're now self-reflexive on top of the DNA, I don't see how that's not a very, very solid component of your scenario of the gene swarm.
Well, but the problem is, Phil, we're about to take control of the gene swarm. No more are we going to be sculpted by the hand of the goddess, but by the hand of the pharmaceutical laboratory technician, which is a fairly...
Or our own artistry, if we pay attention to what we feel like.
Or our own artistry, if we get control of our society and put artists in charge.
Or put yourself in charge of what you wish to be. I mean, for example, again, not wishing to put words in your mouth, but the young lady is obviously very concerned about the feelings of embodiment as the kind of primate that you are right now. Now, I'm not so sure that particularly in a cyberpunk type of an environment, particularly if we're in space, where the amount of resources available to any individual human being, you know, because the young lady might not want to be the living embodiment of the physical goddess Aphrodite. You know, you might want to be a deep space cetacean. I'm not so sure that either one of those present such a problem if the resources are large enough.
Or that either alternative is mutually exclusive. I mean, there's a tendency to fall into a sort of Gnostic dualism and assume that you have to go with either the mind or the body, that it's the spirit passing through the goddess, or whatever you want to call the DNA matrix, or it's being embedded in and trapped in that matrix. Couldn't that natural matrix be itself self-transforming under the current circumstances, and we're all going to go in a certain sense?
Well, I think that's more what it's like, and to a degree we're further down this path than we realize. We could junk the whole time machine metaphor of this morning and come at it like this and say, it isn't the future that we're going to be released into at the end of history. It's the imagination. And the imagination is neither past, present, or future. The imagination is a dimension where we freely command the nature of reality. And so that when the imagination becomes accessible, the laws of physics are obviated and we march off into dream. Now, I'm sure you're all familiar with the concept of dream time in Aboriginal shamanism in Australia. Well, perhaps what history is, I mean, this was certainly James Joyce's point of view, history is a kind of awakening from the dream time, where the dreamer turns and groans and then sits up and looks around and gathers an impression and then falls back down and back into sleep. And that really we have taken on ourselves a kind of prodigal role to leave the dream and to awaken to the possibilities of history, which means the possibilities of the material world, and to carry out a kind of conquest, big male word, a kind of conquest of matter, led largely, almost entirely by men for 2,000 years, but given then back to the goddess of sleep, returning to the river of forgetfulness. But this time with the apparatus to create the dream outside of time. In other words, to create it outside of the possibility of disruption by marauding nearby tribes, shortages, and this sort of thing. In other words, that the journey into history was ultimately a journey back into dream time, archaic time. If I take my own rap seriously, then I think that's what it has to be. And in that case, then, the body is preserved along with everything else. And what we find out then is what we are when we can be anything we can imagine. And whether we would choose to hang on to the body at that point, it probably becomes a matter of taste. I mean, some of us spend all our time reading. Others of us swim at the club twice a day. I mean, there is a broad spectrum of relationships to the fact of the body already. My hope for whatever a psychedelic future is, it should be pluralistic. It has to be more free. Freedom is what we have to be adding into the system. And I see it steadily accumulating through time. And so I think that probably that's not a problem. Yeah, you've been waiting.
Two things. The first one is that it occurred to me that an example of the tendency that we have to be self-reflective, and that manifests in the artifacts we create. And a good example of that now that you can point to is the nature of the interaction of a person who is working on a computer, in that a computer is, like you said, a blank slate, and the environment, internal environment is sort of based on the internal structure of the nervous system that's structuring it. So it becomes like a feedback, a self-reflective feedback situation. The second thing I would like to say is to try to shed some light on the position that psychedelic or entheogens hold relative to this terminal point at the end of history that we're approaching. You mentioned that the beginning of time is a singularity, and the end of history that we were talking about is also a singularity, and that they were connected in some sense. One was perhaps the awakening, this one was perhaps the reemergence into this dream. And we were talking about Morrison in the bookstore, and he points out that the Genesis mythology that exists concerning man's awakening into consciousness, such as the Garden of Eden and the Hyperboreans, are an example of that, all concern a tree with the entheogenic substance soma at the base of the tree, and so the awakening, the beginning of time, is associated with metaphors or symbolism that are relevant to the psychedelic experience and to the psychedelic substance itself. And then here we have, in this period now, psychedelic metaphors which are relevant to this terminal point that we're approaching. And it just occurred to me that psychedelics imagery clusters around both points, this sort of thing, and thereby, the way to affect these transitions must be through the use of entheogenic substances, or at least that must be a major component of it, and that would also tie in with the point brought up that the government is attempting to suppress the use of these things to preserve the status quo because they fear that this transition might be affected. And it's interesting also to point out that the initial cults of Soma, they were developed, out of this origin and then continued for a while, but then eventually Soma was replaced by surrogates. And the tradition continued on, but the ingestation of the substance did not, and there was this period in this middle period where psychedelic or entheogenic use went underground because it wasn't as necessary because the transition was so far away. But now that we're approaching the transition point and we're very close to it, we see an upsurge of the entheogenic use relative to how far away we are from each given point. It's an up or down use cycle.
Well, I think that the reason for that is because, or it's not exactly a reason, I mean, these things are self-reinforcing, but the psychedelics are catalysts for imagination. So consequently, in each case, right before the imagination takes a tremendous leap into a new modality, you will find the psychedelics present. They seem to propel and drive the evolutionary process. The point that you brought up about the self-reflective nature of human beings, all of nature is self-reflective and strives for self-reflection. I don't know if any of you are aware of it or have ever noticed, but when a raindrop flows out to the end of a leaf and hangs there, if there is another leaf behind it at a correct distance and the sun is setting, an image of the entire world will be cast on the leaf behind the drop, because the raindrop acts as a light-gathering lens, a fisheye lens, and it focuses, and there is a little picture of the world on the surface of this leaf. Well, a view, yes. I don't mean the whole planet, I mean the immediate surround. In other words, exactly what we see with our eyes. And yet we think this requires the intercession of a nervous system, vast amounts of processing. No, light, leaf, light, lens, and surface is all that's necessary for this view of the immediate surround to come into being. What is complicated is to have the surface that image shines upon not be a leaf, but a retina that can carry that signal deep into a neural network where it can be recorded, analyzed, compared with previous instances of the same thing, so forth and so on. So this drive for self-reflection is pretty basically there in the stuff of matter, yeah.
Well, as you're talking, I'm thinking back to the singularity, which you started out with, and this sense that I have that time is shifting and that the world with technologies being what they are and affecting nature, the nature of nature is changing. And so hallucinogens, if they are taken at a certain point, will be reflective of a different relationship to nature because nature is changing. And the end of history, as you call it, could be the beginning of non-ordinary history, and because we'll be in a whole we're becoming into a non-ordinary state anyway. And I mean, the end of history may be the beginning of non-ordinary history. And in fact, there was a book written called The End of Ordinary History.
Michael Murphy's
right.
book.
And he relates it to space travel, and that psychedelic experience which happens to cosmonauts and astronauts because nature has changed. That's the hallucinogen at that point.
Well, I think you're right. The nature of nature is changing, and we seem to be centrally caught up in that. The existential or modern view of human beings is that we are somehow have slipped from the control of nature, or were created by God in opposition to nature. And so there's this whole thing about how nature can be plundered and pillaged because it exists for us. It is somehow a thing for us to deal with. But nature is changing, and we are the primary evidence for that. I don't think we've slipped out of control of any of the governors of this planet. I mean, that's taking a lot of pride upon yourself to believe that a bunch of monkeys could truly run against the grain of the planetary destiny. It's rather that we occupy a special niche, a special role in the planetary ecology. We are apparently ourselves catalysts for change. And we tend now, because we have so much of it, to think of this as a bad thing. But perhaps it isn't a bad thing. I was taught when I was studying botany and ecology that before human beings, before the rise of land-clearing, fire-using human beings, the major factor on Earth driving the evolution of plants, the major factor, was the meandering habits of rivers. Because rivers, as they meander, create vast floodplains and sandbars of empty land. And it's into empty land that newly evolving plant species migrate and compete. So before the advent of human beings, it was the land-clearing properties of rivers drove vegetable evolution on this planet. Well, once human beings appeared, then land clearing began on a vast scale, and plant speciation consequently increased apace. Now, granted, the kind of plants that were promoted by this are, from our point of view, aesthetically unsatisfying. It was the geographer Carl Sauer who said, "Man found the world a climaxed rainforest. He will leave it a weedy lot." You see, what happened was that slow-growing annual plants like trees were replaced by rapidly growing, very heavily seeding annual plants. But we have to recall that the appearance of flowering plants, period, is something that has happened very late in the life of the Earth, concomitant to the appearance of mammals on a large scale, come the flowering plants. So we are agents of some kind of planetary change. We always have been. A point Phil made to me at lunch was one of the major reasons for the evolution of pastoralism the domestication of animals and then agriculture was the fact that the hunting had actually become tough work because we had killed off whole populations. And this was very, very early. There was a major paleontological conference held 3 years ago, I think in Toronto, where they concluded that the human impact on Ice Age fauna was immense in the 40,000 to 25,000 year ago period. Well, this is supposedly in the pristine era of ecological balance. People don't realize how long the human impact has been going on the planet. Again, quoting Carl Sauer, or describing his ideas, he believed that there was no such thing as a natural grassland. He believed that every grassland on this planet was an artifact of human burning, and that given the absence of human beings, grasslands cannot arise, that what you get instead are climaxed forest ecologies. He made a pretty good case for that.
And what about the herds of gazelles and all those? They wouldn't be bouncing around in a pretty dense forest, would they?
No, it's thought actually that, or what Sauer talks about, is that the grassland thing was a kind of management of the ecosystem to produce food. You know, it's said that at the time that the Spanish arrived in California, this was one of the most heavily human-impacted environments on the planet. That the California Indians managed California like a vast system of natural parks, and with yearly burning, all kinds of artificial ways of enhancing the environment. In fact, interesting experiments were done where they went to the very earliest missions in California and obtained permission to take the adobe blocks of these earliest missions, and as you know, straw was used as a binder in the making of adobe. So these scientists would take these very old adobe bricks and they would dissolve them in gentle solutions of acids, and then they would study the straw that was left. Well, they showed that there were over a dozen kinds of cereal grains in California when the Spanish arrived under cultivation by the Indians, that no trace of which now remains. Large kerneled wheat and oat-like plants producing a large amount of nutrition. So human management of the ecosystem, and I think that it's been shown by Sauer and others that you can promote the evolution of grasses, of which all cereals are grasses, simply by repeated burning. You see, Sauer's argument that there were no primary grasslands was based on the fact that every single species that you find in the grasslands, you can also find in the forest at the edge of the grasslands as a minor component of the forest. But there are no truly new species in the grassland. So he said what the grassland is a totally impoverished forest ecology. And it's been impoverished by burning, and repeated burning allows only the annual plants to get a foothold, and they rapidly evolve, therefore, and then through human selection and reseeding, you get this promotion of cereals. And as you know, it was the evolution of rye that allowed human beings to occupy ever more northerly parts of the northern hemisphere, and so forth and so on. So we have always been this catalytic species, always involved in implementing and causing change. It's only in the last 50 years at most that anybody ever noticed this and then asked the question, is it a good thing or not? because we are romantics. We do have a great nostalgia for Eden, and you touched on this. It's very interesting. If you look at the Genesis story, what this is immediately about is a drug problem. Somebody has a drug and they're telling other people that they shouldn't use it, and the other people are not following the rules and are using the forbidden fruit, and so then they have to be punished. And it's a story about struggle over who gets to use what plants and who has the say-so about it. So we emerge onto the stage of Western culture with out of the Dawn Age with this whole set of complexes about our role in nature, whether we are natural or unnatural, whether we are on the side of the angels or on the side of the gods, and it all revolves around plants and plant use. The Gnostics took the whole myth of Genesis and just turned it on its head. They didn't reject it. They just changed the players and said, obviously, the serpent was a messenger from the true God. And these poor people were imprisoned in the iron fortress of the mad god Ildabaoth. And the higher and hidden All-Father sent in his mercy the serpent to try and turn these people on to the fact that the guy in charge of the garden wasn't God. He was in fact some kind of renegade, some kind of piratical character who should be overthrown. And so they worshiped the snake and glorified that act of rejection of Ildabaoth. Yeah.
Yeah, your story this morning about history. Looking at Eden, one of the ways to look at Eden, one of the ways to look at the mess that we're in a certain sense, is if you think about the kind of life that the early hunter-gatherers had, in terms of the amount of work, in terms of the environment that they lived in a very real sense, they were living in the Garden of Eden. 60 or 70 human beings, according to some of the latest digs, could live in a 30 or 40 mile an hour circle with somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 to 15% of their time spent gathering food. So that the kind of art that you see in the Venus figures is a very elaborate decoration of life, because they have more leisure time than we do. And that without any kind of particular modern medicine, or without some of the more elaborations of shamanism, they were still living into their 40s. Usually ended up being killed by either an accident or by a massive bacterial illness. But they were quite literally living in the Garden of Eden. And the expulsion from the garden has to do with the plants. The animals are gone, the hunter-gatherers are gone, and now you're a farmer. And that's nowhere near as much fun as being almost the ultimate comic book hippie tribe.
Well, it was Weston LaBarre who said, talking about this same transition, said, the reason people stopped taking hallucinogens was because they had to get up in the morning and go hoe the fields and haul water on their backs to the food plants. And so they replaced the ecstatic, orgiastic hallucinogens with corn and wheat. These became the new gods, and these were gods of hard work, punctuality, family values, the whole shtick, Yeah.
The connection between the serpent in the garden and the forbidden fruit. And if you follow Wasson that the forbidden fruit is Amanita, then it's also interesting to note that Amanita has been represented by monopod type figures and drawings, and it's Satan in one guise or form in folk mythology is a club-footed creature, or a one-footed creature is otherwise deformed in the sense that he's lame and only has 1 foot, which ties in with those one-footed creatures are always metaphors for the monopod mushroom.
Well, whenever you get a strong taboo against something, it's indicative of an earlier stratum of use and then some amount of cultural anxiety about it. And you get prohibitions against mushrooms in Manichaeanism, which is completely puzzling since it arises in an area where mushrooms are very unlikely to be met with. I'm still thinking about this problem about the...
That's what I was to say something about that. Yeah, because it's been bugging me too. This thing about the body, because I was hearing what she was saying, just wandering off into these mental zones as if we know we have a body, we've covered the body, we can let the body go, we don't have to deal with that anymore, we can, because we're able to rise above that, whereas I think for most people, a true familiarity with the body, with one's own body, is something that most people haven't investigated. They said, "Oh yeah, I've got a hand. I can feel my hand. You know, if I do that, it hurts, and so I know I have a hand." And they pass that on. They pass on to the mental realm. And the mental realm is very seductive because our minds are constantly throwing up stuff for us to mentate on. And one of the things that it's the question: what is the body? Who are we? The Buddhists would say that rather than the mind being in the body is in our mind.
Well, isn't that the cultural condition that we're trying to recapture? That's what living in the imagination is.
But the problem is that from a real superficial point of view, when we say the body is in our mind, we lightly skip over the body because it's only in our mind. But the thing is that the body, our body, in terms of our felt experience of reality, of what's real, is like a huge chunk of what's real. It's a bigger chunk of what's real than we pay attention to, because we pay attention to the mental stuff that our mind is throwing up, and there's a tendency to bypass the body and I'm sort of lapsing into inarticulateness.
Maybe we haven't seen the final evolution of these bodies, and what's giving everybody so much difficulty with end of history, and this is not the final form, perhaps.
Well, the body.
Yes, I mean that's right. This is not the final
sprouting
form.
wings and this idea of angelic orders that Blake saw. I mean, perhaps we shouldn't just pass that off as not a possibility, but include it in those possibilities.
But when you
so the awareness, so as one's own consciousness grows, we're just going to be all in agreement on something, whatever it is.
That's also can sound like a future projection. It also can be that this isn't the final evolution of the body in our perception of it. That our perception can change. This may be much, much more than we have ever had a chance to experience.
Yeah, I think that that's certainly true, that we don't really understand what the body is. We don't understand what the body is, and even perhaps more fundamental, we don't know how much of the body is in the mind. What has been implicit in this discussion so far is that these two things are somehow opposed. But how much of the body is in the mind? Would someone care to hazard a percentage? I mean, it becomes absurd. Yeah.
I'm not going to offer a percentage.
And thus skirt absurdity.
A couple of things come to mind. One is the linguistic knot that we're in.
Yes.
Because being that our language by its nature is symbolic, we lose sight of that which we're speaking about because we're watching the symbols march by us.
Yeah.
And body-mind duality, the language that we are using to discuss it is symbolic. The duality is fundamental. And I see the Garden of Eden story as being about sexuality, way back before there were any apes standing around to try and get it on, in which William Irwin Thompson does this, when in order to speed up diversification, you bite the apple, you accept sexuality as a way of juggling those genes faster, but consequently, instead of being one eternal organism, for example, the original amoeba is with us through its mutation, we come and we go in being part of this larger movement. What I see you talking about the end of time, again, it becomes linguistic to me because fundamentally each of us as individuals face that with our death. At a certain point we do drop the body for better or worse.
Isn't that the big question? What happens? What is death? Is death the dissolution of consciousness? Or does something continue? I think that's really the focal point of our physical death. What happens? Can we continue beyond that? If so, in some other form? Or, to me, that's where everything really comes home. And thinking about death is what brings on a lot of the questions.
Well, because I think what we're talking about is, when we talk about the end of history, we're talking about a kind of cultural death. I mean, Merciliade talked about, his analysis of the 20th century was, he compared it to a dying person. And he said, as you die, you review your entire life. It all flashes before you. And here in the 20th century, we're digging up every temple, publishing every book, deciphering every religious text in a frantic effort to reassure ourselves that we are not, in fact, dying. And the very fact that we're doing all this, that we have this obsession with knowing the past, the present, the future, all motivations, everything indicates that we are in this culturally terminal phase.
I have two questions. One is, are we the only species on the planet, you feel, that is functioning in these, I don't know, I hear so much hierarchy in the way we describe higher and lower and all of that, but that's dealing with this issue?
Well, I think we're the only species in history,
Well,
caught in history. Well, no, I don't.
I mean, what about the cetacean mind, for example, out there? They've got a huge computer. Monkeys, they don't make computers just to carry them around.
Well, but earlier on I said I felt that history is the story of technology. Without technology, there is no history. And so the cetaceans, whatever, for the general population, the Dark Ages were characterized by massive economic retraction, epidemic disease, and religious fundamentalism.
Right.
Sounds like fun, doesn't it? Well, this clearly lies directly ahead of us. The epidemic disease is already in place. It will only get worse. The fundamentalists are chewing at their bits. They can hardly wait to be let loose. And the economic retraction just hangs over our heads like a sword of Damocles. But coming out of that, then there will be a shift in values. Essentially, the only way to defeat the right wing is to give it power. Because then, of course, the rich depth of its solutions can be seen. This is what happened to the fundamentalist world of medieval Christianity. It totally triumphed and therefore displayed its utter bankruptcy to the world, and new cynical institutions built on trade and capital and science arose. Now, in the modern context, the bankruptcy of the hellish marriage between Madison Avenue and science and all of the forces of so-called rationalism have created an irrational, insane, contradiction-riddled world. The Third Reich was similar. The Third Reich was supposed to last 1,000 years, 12 years, 4 months, 8 days. After Hitler was elected Chancellor of Germany, his bullet-riddled body was burned in a gasoline-soaked trench beneath the Chancellery in Berlin. Not good for somebody who was shooting for 1,000 years. So, and I think that George Bush is probably the correct person to reap the Reagan legacy. It's only, you know, if really horrible things are about to happen, you want to step away from that situation.
Not good for 55 million people.
Which, the Third Reich?
The Third Reich.
Yes, no, I'm not defending it as a good thing, but I'm saying, do you think a Bolshevik-led civil war in Germany would have led to a happier conclusion? I mean, a war like that could be still going on if Germany had divided along those kinds of lines. This is the principle of the Chinese puzzle, by the way. You know how what a Chinese puzzle is? It's this little woven thing, and you put it on your fingers, and the more you try to pull, the tighter it gets. The more you oppose it, the tighter it gets. What is the solution? Do the exact opposite of reasonable expectation. Relax, move with it, and you just can take it off and get rid of it. This is an old martial arts principle, you know. Let the strength of your opponent be directed through you back to your opponent. The I Ching talks about this and says evil should never be confronted directly. If it is confronted directly, it arms itself. And so evil is always subverted. And what I think is happening in the present situation, and what makes me immune to conspiracy theories of the ordinary sort, is a conspiracy theory always assumes that someone understands what's going on. Nobody understands what's going on. The most important trends in society, I believe, are completely unmonitored. An example of this would be, for instance, the personal computer revolution. I don't believe I'll bet that you would be amazed at the CIA's capacity to tap and decode electronic mail transmissions. I would bet you that they don't have a capacity to do that, that it's simply too technically overwhelming for the amount of information that they think that they're going to get back from it. So consequently, a huge amount of cutting-edge communication, plotting, and chatting slips right through their net. They're off putting cocaine-dealing dictators in place and other similarly 19th century responses to problems, while the real evolution of the situation is happening completely outside their ken. They're always looking in the wrong place. It was Marshall McLuhan who said, people who try to control the world usually are like people who drive a car using a rear-view mirror as their only navigational aid. How successful are you going to be in driving a car if you use a rear-view mirror? I mean, it seems preposterous. So I think that the confusion of the situation is very rich, and that the most important developments go unmonitored because what is defined as important is not really important. For instance, governments are very concerned about who has the money. Well, if you don't have any money, they're not going to bother with you. That's how I escape detection. If I were making $10 million a year doing what I'm doing, I think my phone would be tapped. The fact that I can barely pay my mortgage is ipso facto proof that what I'm doing is irrelevant. Because you see, it's outside their value scheme. So I think that there is an overmind. There is a general, Rousseau called it the general will But I give it more credit than that. I actually think of it as a kind of self-reflection in which we all are embedded as neurons. And the general will releases ideas, crashes the cocoa crop somewhere in the world, can stop the propellers on the plane of the president of Pakistan and plunge a whole policy into confusion. It's the unexpected, or what it really is the cosmic giggle masquerading as the unexpected and just driving them nuts in the war rooms and commodities trading markets of the world. And what it leads toward is an inexorable denouement, a kind of unfolding, a kind of revealing that shows, this is literally some kind of a miracle play, meaning it has its set bad guys, its set good guys, it moves toward a predictable conclusion that contains a resolution of tension, catharsis, and ultimately apotheosis. And this is the great hope of little people everywhere, of which most of us are, let's face it, is that there is a, I don't want to call it biological, but at least a morphogenetic field in which we are embedded that contains the end state we are moving toward. And it exerts an immense influence on what happens. In fact, the definitive and defining influence. I love it when they say now about Gorbachev that it's too late to kill him because the lid is off. They can never get it reconstructed. It doesn't matter now. If Igor Legachev becomes president of the Politburo, it doesn't matter. Once you start one of these cascades going, they have a will of their own. And it turns out history itself in its entirety is one of these cascades. There has never been any question about the outcome. The only question has been how long it would take. And now, as we close distance with the resolution of this process, the question hardly matters for us as individuals because we stand so close to the end state that we can realize it in our own lives right now. This is what shamans have been doing for time immemorial. They've been leaving the historical and geographic confines of their culture and allowing themselves to be at play in the fields of the Lord, allowing themselves to actually come from and go to the trans-historical or post-historical dimension.
One of the things that has bugged me a little bit about the anti-war movement, and not that I don't appreciate, greatly value the work they're doing, but in terms of the way they look at what they're doing, there's this tendency to see that if we can only stop the brink, if we can only stop thermonuclear war, then everything will be fine. And I feel like the real thing is to imagine the world we want to have after that war is stopped. To design in our minds the paradise that we want to have for everybody, because if one does that, then one also assumes within that the stopping of nuclear war. If one goes towards simply stopping nuclear war, it's kind of like you're racing toward that point, and are you going to quit, like that? If you go for the great world that we're going to have after it, you're already shooting for here. You cut it off, and otherwise, you stop the nuclear war, but you still got this big mess on it. We still have a mess on our hands because nobody thought about it because all they were thinking about is not to die.
Yeah, well, we have a real mess on our hands with or without nuclear war. I mean, the presence of germ warfare, bactericidal warfare, the dissolution of the ozone layer, all of these things mean that we are in a planetary crisis of major proportions. It's amazing to me that we could have this INF treaty, and no one has ever said that it might lead to the banning of war. In fact, these generals come on TV and explain how now we're going to have even larger defense budgets because, of course, you know, nuclear weapons were so cheap, such marvelous effectiveness for the amount of money invested. And if you want to get rid of nuclear war, well then, boy, we're really going to have to spend on conventional weapons, because so it is never even mentioned the possibility that this could be the beginning of banning war as an institution, and that's because it is absolutely necessary to the calculation of these ego-driven social systems that war be available as a recourse. I don't know how many of you have read the fiction of William Gibson. If you haven't, you should. Books like Neuromancer and Count Zero. Here is a world where apparently there are no nuclear weapons, or if there are any, they're so carefully under control that they're not worrying anybody. And yet this is a hell world beyond your wildest imaginings, and it lies just ahead of us, 20, 25 years in the future. There are all kinds of factors that can overthrow the drive to transcendence. And this brings up something that I wanted to mention, which Phil mentioned, which is, even though this has been a talk about the vertigo at the end of history, there's been very little talk about space and space migration as an option here. We've talked about downloading everybody into chips or possibly going off into hyperspace, and yet no mention of the previously much hyped scenario of living in vast colonies in space. I think the reason for this is there's a real technological gap. To just hold the present population of the planet steady, we would have to carry something in the order of 275,000 people a day off the planet. And, you know, we're barely able to launch a lawn chair into orbit at this point. I mean, the proud, bold dreams of a few years ago have been replaced by the sober facts of the matter. Now, that doesn't mean that there couldn't be some kind of breakthrough. Some of you may know these pinwheel schemes, where you put what is essentially a very long fiber in orbit around the planet, rotating against the plane of the planet. So every time it comes around to Bolivia, it descends and picks up something the size of the Queen Mary and hurls it into space. But believe me, we're a long, long way from this sort of thing. Also, I think there's been a fair degree of realism in the ecological community. We can't even manage the national forests of this country. The thought of trying to manage the ecosystem of 1 million+ inhabitants and all the animals and plants attendant upon them at L5 is pretty daunting. So it may be, you know, anything could change. I mean, superconductivity could deliver an instrument in our hands where we could move chunks of real estate the size of New Jersey off planet, or something like that. But we cannot assume such deus ex machina kinds of events. Probably most of the hand that we are going to be dealt when we arrive at the 20th century, at the 21st century, I'm like Dan Quayle, has been dealt already. I mean, I don't place faith in a tremendous technological breakthrough, I think we're going to have to work largely with what we have. The other thing is, you know, I've seen statistics where they estimate that if we were to continue a kind of exponential growth rate, then the available real estate and material in the solar system is only good for about 500 years. The Larry Niven calculated to be wildly optimistic. So we're talking about an era of limits in all cases short of the discovery of faster-than-light drive in the next 15 or 20 years, which doesn't look like a safe bet at this time. Yeah, Phil.
I guess then the very direct question is, what do you do with 5 billion people and 4% compound annual growth rate? And a planet whose carrying capacity is probably well below that.
Well, I think that it's a real problem. That, first of all, what you don't do is you don't accept war as a thinning strategy. It's this whole problem of education and interference. I mean, I was reading recently, you know, China had a 2-child policy, which was quite rigidly enforced. It's now 1 child. Well, it's all broken down. And the World Health Organization says that the introduction of capitalism and democracy into China has totally undermined this effort. And now the growth rate in China is beginning to move back off the scale. Well, what in the world do you do in these kinds of situations? We are going to have to make very hard choices about freedom and responsibility. And this also addresses the drug thing, the population thing. I don't know. I mean, one would like a deus ex machina opportunity, you know, like hyperspace, a nearby dimension that we could just go into. This is what happened for Europe 500 years ago. They were approaching all of these problems. And then, lo and behold, somebody sailed the ocean blue, and they discovered 50 million square miles of empty land which they could move into, and that averted the crisis for the European mind until now, when it will be much more difficult to solve.
A very specific quantifiable question. In your opinion, what do you think the carrying capacity of the planet is?
Well, the carrying capacity of the planet, it's a problem. I mean, as you...
Depends on whether it's United States style or Indonesian
yes,
style.
so are you going to accept Calcutta? Are you going to accept Calcutta and Mexico City? Are these viable institutions as presently constituted?
The reason for the question is a trick question. And that is that the carrying capacity of the planet is significantly smaller than the number of human beings on it. If
right
we
now.
accept any kind of reasonably human future, I mean a hell of a lot smaller than 5 billion.
Well, this is why we have to be very, very politically careful. Because, again, looking back at the European example, in 1355, a third, count 'em, folks, 1/3 of the people of Europe died because of the Black Death. Nobody sheds a tear for these people. This was as devastating as anything that's ever happened in Europe. World War II came nowhere close to killing 1/3 of the population of Europe. But the Black Death did. Well, how did the centuries that followed view that? As a tremendous stroke of good luck, because it pushed back many kinds of crises of resource distribution and availability. And, you know, George Ball, as recently as 10 or 12 years ago, was talking about triage in the third world. Those of you who don't know what triage is, that's where the medics go out on the battlefield and pile the people too shot up to be saved in one place, and they don't get any morphine, any medication, anything, because it all has to go to those that have a chance of making it through. George Bush suggested that that there be a list of countries that would be treated this way. No international loans, no infusions of capital or high technology, because it was wasted to send it to Bangladesh. It just meant that people in Zimbabwe and Uganda had less of a chance of making it. So, you know, these horrible possibilities loom.
It's like anybody with an IQ over 120, you kill them.
That's right. Anybody who can read, the get the smart guys syndrome, of which there may be much more of that. So I think we've entered into a very delicate environment, different than anything we're used to. And the thing that we need to bear in mind is how spoiled we are in terms of rights and privileges. Things have been going pretty smoothly since 1945. Oh yes, a lot of blood shed among the brown, yellow, and black people, but it's all been kept at the periphery. We have no notion of how fragile democratic rights are. It won't take the end of the world. Hell, all it takes is an epidemic of a sexually transmitted fatal disease, and they're ready to register everybody. Or any of a dozen factors could be used as an excuse to get rid of all kinds of civil rights. The possibility that somebody could carry a bomb onto an airplane totally affects the civil rights of all of us. The possibility that somebody might be dealing junk somewhere means your telephone can be tapped without getting a judge's order, means you in your car can be stopped and searched for no reason. So it's very important for people who come out of the glorious liberal tradition, the proud liberal tradition, the viable liberal tradition, to stand up and be counted. And as you see by watching Michael Dukakis, the orthodox liberal response is just an orgy of gutlessness. Yeah.
One of the simple conclusions I've thought about this is, given where we are now and where we need to go, there's no question that there is going to be a certain amount of suffering. There's no way to get from here to there without a lot of suffering. And so the question simply is how that suffering is distributed.
Well, I think it should be locally administered.
Yeah, but any fantasy that someone has, New Age fantasy, that there's some sort of a quick fix which is going to get us through with no suffering from anybody, is such a total fantasy that we have to junk that fantasy and realize that suffering is going to take place. And then, at the same time, we have to own up to the fact then that if we're somewhat spiritual people, we have to be willing to take on some of that suffering ourselves. We have to be open rather than to say, "Oh, I'm going to try to fix it so that the suffering is all distributed out there and not here," and because somebody else has got that same plan over there. To do it distributed over here.
Well, I'm sure you've all seen this bumper sticker, I don't know who puts it out, Earth First or somebody, that says, "Live simply, that others may simply live." And this is certainly the basis for a global ethics. I mean, it is intolerable that some people can be spending $25,000 on an automobile and other people cannot get together a $300 a year annual income. I mean, it is obscene. I heard on Will's show 2 weeks ago, he had the psychologist Stan Groff on, and Groff made a very important point, which really comes back to point at our community, because it's a point about drugs. He said, we have the money to feed the hungry. We have the money to clothe the naked. We have the money to do what needs to be done. What we do not have is the will, the fixity of purpose, the decency of soul to do it. So in other words, the major problem we confront lies between our ears. It isn't that we can't dam rivers, grow food, transport it anywhere, cure disease. We can do all of that. What we cannot seem to do is discipline ourselves to behave in a caring and community-minded way toward each other. And yet the technology that we have unleashed has made us into a village. I mean, the Prime Minister of Bosnia is ousted in a committee meeting. You know it. Within hours, you know it. An airplane crashes in the western reaches of China. We know it instantly. These are facts within the village, gossip within the village system. But we do not behave. We still have 19th century reflexes, as though these things were 6 months away by packet ship or something like that. We are not responding to our technology fast enough. We are the lagging part of the feedback loop. And the reason we're lagging is a failure of imagination. We cannot envision what it is that we have set in motion. We cannot picture where we are. And this turns back then to the question of the psychedelics as catalysts of imagination. We must think in very large terms. We have to hold an image in our mind of the last 1,000,000 years and the next 1,000,000 years for all 5+ billion of us. We have to stimulate our language, our social institutions, our feelings, all of these things to be cognizant with the situation as it presently exists. This is again abandoning the rear view mirror way of driving the culture. We have to stop looking backwards, look forward. That doesn't mean abandon the lessons of history, but it does mean cease to try and recreate the historical situations of the past, specifically to accept the open-ended evolutionary nature of the culture. Then there may be some kind of forward escape. I mean, we've talked about a number of them today in what I am sure the future will see as extremely quaint terms. A notion like downloading into chips. I can tell that this is an idea, when stated that way, is so freighted with wrong assumptions that it's just laughable. But the future might realize something along those lines, that it would not describe that way. We may be headed for a destiny in the bones of the planet, or off the planet, or in an entirely other dimension. Or perhaps we are going to discover time travel and will distribute ourselves through the Jurassic and build a series of Jurassic civilizations, no trace of which exists today, but which are islands in time that antedate the historical episode, something like what you were talking about with your guest. We cannot anticipate the shape of the solution because it actually lies outside the ken of our current language. But what we can do is attempt to force the evolution of our language in order to force the evolution of our psychology into a truly global mode, which is the only mode that holds any hope at all for our survival. Otherwise, your only choice is utter despondency, or you can go out and join a flying saucer cult, or begin to prepare for Jesus' coming, or one of these sort of responses, which I find extremely unsatisfying and, in fact, toxifying, because they draw energy into what seem to me to be completely unproductive byways. Yeah.
Well, just sort of getting back a little bit to the use of psychedelics and how that can affect the way that we act, I have a sense that, from past experiences with psychedelics, that in tapping into the nature of that realm, that we're actually affecting things also for the planet. Do you have that same sense?
Well, I think, going back to what I said this morning, that the psychedelic state is an immersion in this thin stream of information flowing backward from the future. To the degree that we can embody and communicate this future information, we embody and communicate the solution. I mean, the solution is clear. It's to be a loving, authentic, caring, attentive person. The problem is, when you're a monkey, how to be that. And if the psychedelics give us impetus in either large or small ways to embody this future state, then we bring it that much closer. So it is really, we are bootstrapping ourselves toward our own future. This is really what shamanism is all about and always has been about. The way Merciliade puts it is, he says, the shaman is a paradigmatic figure. In other words, the shaman is how everybody else wants to be. Wise, strong, healthy, caring, engaged, socially important, socially respected, well thought of, sought after, so forth and so on. And the shaman takes that upon himself to be an exemplar, to act out the hero. And it's not an easy thing to be. It's an impossible thing to be, I maintain, without getting in touch with the source of that titanic heroism. And the source of that titanic heroism lies ahead of us in the future. And to the degree that we can become exemplars of that, we not only dissolve our own neuroses, our own psychoses, but we also give permission to other people to be that way. I mean, I have seen this in my own life. I came into this so-called New Age scene an extremely cynical person. I mean, I basically was included in the New Age because there was nowhere else for me to go. And, hundreds of hugs, hot tubs, and meditations later, stick passings and soy orgies and all this stuff, I believe. I mean, I am willing to accept there was no case for it. It did not make sense as an argument, but it does make sense as a feeling and as a way of being. And one thing leads on to another. And really what it is it's a reinstating of the goddess, a reconnecting with the feminine and the immediate on every level. Attention to attention. Attention directed beyond the desires and wishes of the ego toward the general human enterprise, an awareness of the past, an awareness of the ancestral energy and the cascade that one is part of, an awareness of the future, of the enterprise, that life does mean something. It does count for something. I mean, this is what we have to rediscover for ourselves, because the legacy of 20th century philosophy is to argue against this, to say, you know, nature is mute, you can be good or you can be bad, it doesn't matter, it's just what you can get away with. All this situationalism and this sort of thing completely cuts us off from meaning. And the meaning is there, outside the institution, outside the confines of the ego. There is the intent of nature, the matrix which supports us, in which we are embedded, and for which we act out and articulate the very, very special function of self-reflection. I mean, we are part of a universal drama. We are not impotent spectators to it, as science would have us believe. The theater of all possibilities is really in our own heads. What we make of the planet, what we make of evolution on this planet, depends on what degree we can connect with the modalities of the past and future. And the only way to do this reliably and on a scale of intensity that can actually restructure behavior is through the psychedelics. This is why they are frightening. This is to those who use them and to those who don't. This is why they are repressed. And this is why, regardless of the nature of the political climate, there's a moral obligation to talk about this stuff.
Could you talk a little bit more about fear?
That the people who use them have?
Yeah.
Well, I think I've said enough about the fear of those who don't use them, because they just fear the dissolving of their boundaries and their game. The fear on the part of those who do use them is, I think, they also fear the dissolving of the boundaries and the game. I mean, it is not easy to advocate this kind of pure anarchy. I mean, maybe it's easy to advocate it. It's not so easy to practice it. I mean, I find that I never take psychedelics without fear and trembling, because outside the structures that the culture has empowered, we're taught that there's only madness. You know, the dark oceans of the unconscious, all these kinds of metaphors, danger, dragons, sea monsters live in those areas. We all have this tremendous tendency to cling to our old self-images, to resist growth, and to say, well, I'm 40 or I'm 80. I don't have to change anymore. I've done all the changing I need to do. Well, the fact of the matter is there is no end of it, and there is no life and no vitality and no meaning without it. What modernity has robbed us of is risk. I mean, there is danger in modern society, but it's highly unpredictable. Somebody runs you down or beats you up to mug you. Well, that didn't require courage to face. You had no choice. But courage, that means situations where you discipline yourself to face what you don't like, is the thing that modern people most organize their environments against. And yet that is what is necessary, because it's authentic. You're putting something on the line, and so there can be real growth, real gain, real progress. And believe me, when the world is placed in the scales of Anubis, the jackal-headed god of death, then it is only the real which counts. The talk, the cant, the metaphor, all that is blasted away. And the real authenticity is what is left behind. And this is what shamanism holds out as a model for personality, and this is what reconnecting to Gaia through the psychedelic plants is capable of empowering. It's nothing less than the salvation of our own souls, nothing less than a redemption of the overmind from what is otherwise what William Blake called eternal death, the death from which there is no reclamation.
So this information that you just gave us, was that the impetus that took you to Central America, or you talked about courage, and now you're talking about an understanding that's really going on around you? Is that what kind of took you to Central America, or gave you the courage, or was you just foolhardy, or what?
Well, youth is foolhardy.
Oh, we're talking about youth.
Yes, I mean, I got into all this stuff when I was 20 years old, and I was motivated by mysticism. I mean, I had read Evelyn Underhill and all that stuff, and then Aldous Huxley, and I wanted to believe that it was possible and doubted it. And what my life is testimony to is the reality of the transcendent. I am not a flake or an airhead, and I do not give great credence to all the fragile suppositions of the New Age. But nevertheless, I tell you, here and now, the rationalist is a fool. The reductionist is a moron, because there are things which haunt this world that are, stranger than we can suppose, and they are accessible. You just have to know how to do it, and so far as I've been able to find out, there's only one way to do it. I mean, talk is cheap, chakras, drumming, diet, yak, this and that, but there are things which work, friends. The fact that there are so many things which don't work should not cause anybody to lose heart. There is somewhere in that phony freak show a reality that before which one can only respond with awe. And we're told that's not so, that the world is cut and dried, that it's all very simple. That's the first myth that you have to dissuade yourself of. And that's the fastest way to do that, is just take 5 dried grams of mushrooms, and you will quickly be conveyed into the atrium of the mystery. And from that vantage point, you can see that, my goodness, we were sold a line about the spiritual emptiness of the world. I mean, the world is teeming with gods, demons, gnomes, and a whole pantheon of who knows what.
Is that the recommended dose of 5 grams?
That is the recommended dose.
Regardless of weight, height, or age?
Well, no, I would say anybody who weighs less than 140 should probably cut it down a gram or so. But it's not going to hurt you. It's better to do more than less.
There's no scope so much. You might want to suggest for those who don't, they try that book so much.
Yes.
What was that?
Yeah. That smoking cannabis is also a very basic part of this, with the mushroom, to navigate.
Would one do that first or afterwards?
Well, I don't know about one.
Oh, you're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about
Would you smoke and then take the mushrooms, or would you take the mushrooms and then later smoke?
Well, I smoke before they come on in order to assuage my nervousness about the fact that they're going to. And then once they come on, I smoke in order to navigate, I call it. In other words, if you get in a slightly stuck place, you just take a hit.
Smoking grass makes me more nervous, so.
Well, yes, this is an individual thing. It may not be for everybody. The way I do it is I take the mushrooms, and they take about 40 minutes to an hour and 20 minutes to come on. During that time, I sit quietly in the darkness and worry and attempt in that period to expunge myself of worry by getting it all taken care of. And I recall all the people I've wronged and all the terrible things I've done. And this is so that when it actually comes on, I won't be hit. Yes, this is called
expiation.
Yes, it's called make a good examination of conscience. You go through the commandments one by one. Honor thy father and thy mother. Did I honor my father and my mother? Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife. Did I covet my neighbor's wife? And so forth and so on. Is it? Oh, you don't? Well, congratulations. Yeah.
I wanted to speak to this question of, is there any other way to get there? I've taken psychedelics a number of times, going back to my 20s, and in the last couple of years, I've also studied a little bit more intensely meditation and Buddhist, Dzogchen meditation, certain sort of subtle things. And from my own experience, if you take, say on a scale of 1 to 10, being normal consciousness is 1, and maybe being really happy in a good day is 2, and as far as I've gotten on psychedelics is a 10. I have, at least on one occasion, gotten to about 6 on meditation. And so one of the things that I find is that there is a quite useful and possible link between meditation and psychedelics in the sense that the directions that they're taking you are both very similar directions. And when moving into psychedelics, what you said you did when you sat down before you did it is essentially like a certain kind of a meditation. And there's a whole raft of techniques of meditation. For instance, devotion to the deity, simply the idea of devotion to the deity, and holding that thought, holding it, concentrating on the breath, watching one's thoughts and one's thought process, all these things. And I just want to say that, I keep going back to psychedelics and I'm very interested in those, but I've also found that I can move toward higher states. In this one particular case, I felt it was rather extraordinary.
Well, you didn't say anything that I disagree with, but you were very careful in what you said. I think that it must be true that these yogas, meditations, yantras, mantras, visualization, sort of move you toward it. But the claim is always made that they're better than. And I just don't believe it. I mean, unless you're unbalanced, perhaps then it works. But I think that it's basically a co-option by priestcraft of the psychedelic state. But it also has to be said that clearly in the physiology of unstoned human beings, there is the potential for transcendence. I just have never heard of a technique or tried a technique that convinced me it was possible. What has convinced me that it's possible is the fact that I have had, and other people I know, have had dreams where in the dream someone came at them with a psychedelic, like a pipe full of DMT, and they smoked it, and they had the trip in the dream. Well, that proves that it is somehow, under certain conditions, possible to force the full unfolding of the psychedelic. So if I were, for some reason, just so put off by drugs that I just couldn't stand the idea of drugs, and I wanted this kind of transformation, I don't think I would study yoga or these things. I think I would look at lucid dreaming and try to enter the lucid dreaming state and then take LSD in my dream and see how that worked. I don't know. I'm just putting that out there.
Dream and then meditate.
Yes, and then, I know. And one last thing that I want to say, which is whatever we may say about whether or not techniques like mantras, yantras, and yoga work better than drugs. It is certainly true that they work tremendously well with psychedelics. But this is, to my mind, what the tradition really was for. They must have forgotten to mention. And if, for instance, you read the Yoga Sutra of Patanjali, which is the source of all yogic texts, it was written in the 2nd century BC. It's called the Yogic Sutra of Patanjali, Patanjali. And he mentions in there, at the very beginning, the 3 techniques for spiritual transcendence. And they are control of breath, control of attention, and light-filled herbs. That's the phrase that is used. Well, the third one, light-filled herbs, is never mentioned again. Obviously, because that was the secret portion of the teaching. They were willing to teach you the yantra, the mantras, the positions, the pranayama, the whole shtick.
So the herbs put the guru out of business.
The herbs put the guru out of business. Or the herbs put the shaman back into business.
Perhaps it's because they require little explanation as well.
It's very anti-establishment.
The experience.
Yes, it erodes hierarchy, it erodes secret knowledge, it is liberating and democratic, and I hope this meeting has been the same. Thank you very much for your time and attention. It was a pleasure for me.
Who's the guy with the penis? Where's that son of a bitch?